Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our People Agility during COVID-19 session. My name is Emily Robinson, and I am part of the HR consulting team here at RSM. For today's session, I am joined by Anne-Marie Southall from Concerto and Peter Hobbs from Bondell Professional Development. Anne-Marie and Peter will introduce themselves properly in a moment, but before we jump into the session, I wanted to draw your attention to our sector survey. At RSM, we run an annual social housing health of the sector survey, which assesses the impact of the change in economic, political and regulatory conditions within the social housing sector. The survey is now 14 years strong, and would really appreciate your responses in helping us shape a snapshot of what do you think will affect the social housing sector and what will be the likely impact. To respond, please click on the link that in the slides, which will be circulated after the session, which is great news for everybody, so look out for that. You'll get an email probably at the start of next week. And our survey actually closes on the 5th of February. If you have any questions relating to the survey, then obviously do feel free to get in touch. Next slide, please. Now on to some practicalities. Today we'll be using the Q&A and the chat functionality. To submit questions, please use the Q&A function, which is located at the bottom of the screen. If that doesn't immediately show up, then please use the ... icon as we show on the screen here and select Q&A. You'll also see the chat icon, and we'll be using that quite frequently during today's session. Can we just point out, we will remind you when we do this, that when using this, if you can ensure you select everybody in the to box, then everybody will be able to see the comments that are being shared. Next slide, please. And I'll now hand over to Anne-Marie to kick off the session.
And the first thing that Anne-Marie has to do is to remember to unmute herself. So everybody, I'm Anne-Marie Southall. My background is, just briefly, I started off in the car industry a long time ago now, then spent many years at PricewaterhouseCoopers in their consulting team, and then joined my present organisation, Concerto. And I think it's fair to say I've probably done pretty much everything there is to do in terms of people, from reward through performance management, through you name, I seem to have done it, landing up very fairly and squarely in the area of working with culture development and change management. We're going to be talking to you today about people agility. I think it's fair to say that the events of 2020 have certainly brought us into some interesting and challenging times. We have a pandemic that seems to be particularly adept at adapting itself. One could even say that it's proven to be quite agile. And an economic marketplace that doesn't seem to know what will hit it next. And within the housing sector, those of you who logged into our conference yesterday would have heard about some further changes, which will be bringing, first from government, a white paper, changes in the November spending review and the March budget. You've also had a new code of governance from the National Housing Federation, and also an increase in cyber attacks to contend with. And it seems from the responses from our pre-seminar survey that a number of you see an urgent need for stress reduction strategies in your organisations, and it's hardly surprising given all the changes that we're having to contend with. There's no doubt that many of us are finding that the way that we're having to work and the uncertainties generally very, very stressful. And there certainly is a place for lots of the mental first aid strategies and apps that we are increasingly seeing, and perhaps more about that later. But we'd also like to sort of think a bit more generally about agility and make a case for us using the time that we have right now to build agile organisations so that we and the people, of course, who live and work and within those organisations are well placed to do whatever we need to do as we come out of the pandemic into whatever the marketplace has in store for us. So first of all, we're going to look at what it means to be agile. We know that the pandemic has transformed the way that we work. And in fact, I have a client who this time last year had spent 6 months trying to decide whether they were going to take the leap implement Office 365. And I think it's fair to say that within 2 weeks of the lockdown in March, they had actually not only made the decision, but they had rolled out to most of their organisation new laptops, new software, new training tools, and really embraced kind of a remote way of working, which absolutely would have been unthinkable this time last year for them. And many organisations were in a similar situation. Many leaders are also struggling to understand what comes next, what's going to happen after the pandemic is finished, if it sort of ever does finish in a way that we might hope it will. But what's next for us? Lots has been written about remote working and collaboration and how we make the office safe and how we look after our people. And I mean, that has also, of course, brought us additional costs that we've had to contend with. But very little is actually being thought about in terms of what do we do on a longer term basis. Next slide, please, Peter. Peter, could I have the next slide, please? Okay, I'm not quite sure what's happening. Here we go. Right. Thank you. So at this point, we'd like to try and make the session as interactive as we possibly can, given the constraints of the technology is bringing us. But we wonder whether you could take just a few seconds to type into the chat box. So if you click on chat, make sure that you select send to all rather than send to host. Any short phrases which will tell us a little bit about what agile means to you. What do you think? What are the sort of challenges that we're facing right now? If you could enter that into the chat box, that would be great. Thank you. We're beginning to get some people contributing to the chat box. That's great. Thank you. So yeah, what it means to be flexible, what it means to be mobile. Okay, thank you. That seems to be, here we go, a bit more here. Yeah, needed to be able to respond in the right way for now and the future. Yeah, enable people to be bold. Yeah, I like that, to make the right decisions. Oh, they're rolling in now. New ways of being available to customers and staff. Ability to work where we want and where we need to, as far as the business is concerned. Yeah, ability to respond. Make sure we get the right message. Listening more. Hugely important. Okay, thank you.
Good.
And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Peter.
Okay, thank you, Anne-Marie. Maybe just before I launch into looking at what was said, quickly to introduce myself. Vondel Professional Development, of which I'm the Managing Director, is an organisation that focuses primarily on the whole area of agile project management and agile project management and change. So that's how Anne-Marie and I have been working together. And what I hope to be able to bring to this session is just a bit of a perspective of some of the ways in which organizations can make themselves a little bit more agile. If you look at the items that you put into that chat box, there's perhaps some of the themes that you've identified are the ones that you can see on the left-hand side of the screen there. And that whole focus on flexibility, work locations, an interesting one about mindset there, and obviously the structured part of it, contracts of employment as well. Thinking about that, and something also about, I think there was the ability to respond, a whole idea of agile organizations being very personal indeed, and the centrality of making them environments in which people really thrive. Perhaps one thing that is missing, I may have missed it, but perhaps one thing that's missing is this compelling idea of a compelling why, which will return, or a sense of purpose within the organization. We'll return to that later, but first, to ground this presentation in reality, let's just consider what has happened as far as COVID's concerned, where we are now. If you look at the blue tiles on the screen now, you can see that it summarizes various different viewpoints what strikes me is that if you look on the left-hand side in the middle there, you're seeing that employees and business leaders seem to be working from home as a trend that they'd like to continue. But on the right-hand side there, the ONS survey suggests that businesses are not quite so sure, and that a quarter of businesses down the bottom left-hand corner there have seen their business efficiency decrease, which obviously is quite a serious problem as far as organizations will be concerned. On the right-hand side, 85%, the McKinsey study there suggests that a lot of people consider that the genie is out of the bottle as far as many of these digital technologies are concerned. And the question really is whether we will see more or less working from home. Will we see more or less virtual team working? How about you? How do you see it? What about how has working from home impacted the performance of your organization? Do you see the impact of COVID being permanent, or is there a hunger to return to the old ways? And I suspect it's probably a bit of a pick and mix here. Now we're going to do a couple of polls here. What I'm going to do is let's start off with the first one, a bit of fun really. Working from home, and I suspect a number of you will have seen or heard these kinds of things happening on the Zoom calls or the virtual teamwork calls that you've been involved in. What I'm going to ask you to do, you can see the poll has just opened on the right-hand side there, and I'm going to ask you to vote on the ones that you have heard. It's up to you how many you choose. You can choose all of them, or you can just select the ones that you've seen in the last 10 months. Going to give you a minute to do so. Anne-Marie very kindly trialed the you're on mute, which all of us, I'm sure, have heard at some stage. Hopefully we'll be able to share those results in a second.
Yes, I'm just unmuting myself now to sort of prove that I can still use the button and I still know where it is.
Yeah. And I should really have said, sorry, guys, my Wi-Fi is rubbish this morning. I think I dropped off briefly earlier. Okay, how are we doing? Are we able to? Okay, so, yep, 81% of you, you're on mute. 32%, that's interesting. Oops, got the wrong screen. Yep, maybe, hopefully not. But those who are in that 32% probably have some amusing stories to tell us to exactly what happened. A bit of fun, as I say, and the results are there for you to see. But there is actually a serious point there, and it's that last one there. Actually, how do you monitor the mental health of a remote team? As leaders, we've got to be adept at getting beyond fine and feel comfortable with conversations that get from what I call WIGO, what's going on, to WIRGO, what is really going on. And to that end, I've been beta testing an app produced by a mental health charity called Inside Out, which allows people to assess and communicate their mental form in a simple number out of 10. It works on 10 parameters. It looks at 10 aspects of life: diet, exercise, sleep, workload, etc., how involved you are at work. And it asks the user to score themselves in all of those areas, and then it creates an aggregate score out of 10. The most recent version, which is literally just come out, I gather has a link to your internal email signature block, so that whenever you email colleagues in the chosen group that you consider to be your internal team, you actually post your form score at the same time. It's a great way of prompting a conversation. And interestingly, often even really quite a high score, sort of an 8 out of 10 or something, is something that's worth probing, because there could be one area that's dragging all the other scores down. I'd urge you to consider that kind of event. You may well have, or of application, you may well have something of that kind in your locker already. And if so, I'm sure that the rest of the group would be delighted to hear what it is in the chat bar. Now we're going to do a serious poll. This is actually something that I'd be really interested to. You can only answer on one of these at this stage. What would be really helpful to know is how has your organisation's productivity been affected by working from home? I'm going to give you a second to just tick one. And once, Bethany, you've got a sort of quorum, if you can display the results, that'd be great. Okay, there we are. So, just looking at the results, it would appear that decreased slightly, increased, yeah. Most people, or the majority, are probably in the slightly, either it stayed about the same, decreased slightly, but actually at the top end, several 15% of you have said it's increased substantially and increased slightly. Again, the question really, any thoughts on why you answered as you did? Unfortunately, with the WebEx functionality, we can't get into a discussion at this stage, but this is the moment to just reflect, scribble a few ideas on notes that you can return to after the event. Let's go on. I want to just ground, have a look back at those tiles again, because one of the things that when you take those tiles, there's an additional piece of information which comes from Gallup, which I think is probably quite relevant as far as this is concerned. Most of you will have heard of Gallup as political pollsters. What you may not know is a large part of their business is focused on strength-based leadership, using the Clifton Strengths psychometric. And they work in recruitment, career management, team effectiveness. It's something that as part of my work with agile project team leaders, I do a lot of coaching using this tool. They're also leading players in the field of employee engagement surveys. And what was referenced here, the Q12 survey, some of you may well know it. It's an engagement survey developed over 20 plus years, seen by many as the gold standard in pulse monitoring of employee attitudes and engagement. Now, 21% more profitable, and having 41% less absenteeism is really indicates a strong causal link between engagement and business performance. And perhaps if there's time later on, we can dig further into that data in our discussion. What's more, Gallup's research shows that engagement is particularly important in times of turbulent times, which is what we have. If you look at these tiles now, I've just added 3 more, or 2 more blue tiles, and what you have here, job vacancies well below levels of January in January, and this was actually this data was produced in November last year. But note that 41% is minus 41% is almost double that of Japan and more than double the other countries referenced. Perhaps that's a combination of COVID and Brexit. Not terribly positive. But let's draw back from the individual surveys and generalize what it means to be, what seems to be going on here in relation to agility. Grouping factors under internal and external. First, let's look at external. As far as the external environment is concerned, and the presentation yesterday very much stressed this as well, continuous disruptive change in all markets, and the housing association, your market isn't immune from that. The rise of the digital economy is something that is going to transform the way many businesses do work. Shocks, obviously the pandemic, we've got Brexit, we've had fortunately it's not so much the shock, but the move back towards sanity in the US, but the way that the US has been operating in the last 4 years has contributed significantly to global turbulence. In fact, unclear horizons in all the pestle categories, and just at risk of teaching you to suck eggs or anything, pestle, political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental. It's beloved of strategy consultants as a way of analyzing the external market. Then on top of this, and in some cases responding to it, we've got internal issues to deal with as well. Generation Z has got a real change in aspiration. We're finding a very different attitude towards work, towards life, different priorities, where new technologies have allowed changes in the way that we operate. We've had various other new communications platforms, ways of using communication, new opportunities to collaborate, new approaches, very different business models that are allowed to add value, create additional value for clients, reduce your cost base, hedge risks, and leverage assets. Frankly, I would say that on that basis, the case for agility is pretty compelling. So what we want to do now is just look at why more organizations aren't as agile as one would expect. The first block to agility that I've identified is what I refer to as bad agility, in a nod to one of my heroes, Richard Rommeld, whose book Good Strategy, Bad Strategy is a really excellent work on looking at how to create strategy within businesses. Rommeld observes something strange, that all business leaders know that good strategy is key to success, but actually few have one. And his view and his finding in his work is that the biggest hurdle to development of good strategy is thinking that you have one when you don't. Bad strategy is often based on an annual planning process and formulating approaches which actually blocks genuine thought. And I believe the same thing is true of agility. Too many people pay lip service to it. They use the term, they wear the T-shirt without really engaging with what it means to take courageous steps necessary to implement it. Bad strategy, in turn, is caused by 4 mistakes. The first one is what I would refer to as selective adoption. Now, I'd like you to have a look at these 2 lists. If you look at these 2 lists, we've got maybe a less than flattering depiction of what might be termed traditional ways of working as against agile ways of working. The one on the right obviously describes a bit of a utopia, and on the left, probably something that most people would say not so sure that they'd like to work in. Our experience is that a pick and mix approach, selective adoption of different agile approaches, doesn't work. You can't be semi-agile any more than someone can be semi-pregnant. Look at the agile list and see if it can be improved by the inclusion of any of the traditional elements. The point is that agility requires wholehearted and sustained commitment to embed it, as there's always a danger of reversion to the traditional, which in some senses is really, when things are working reasonably well, a very safe option. The question is whether safety is going to lead us to long-term survival. Next block is one that we find often is operational flexibility without strategic insight, and I think this is really key to why we've approached this topic in this way. Is that it's all very well to be agile, people-centered, and flexible, but without strategic insight, we don't actually have a direction of travel. Agile may be seen as very new, but actually it's a rediscovery of the approach taken by any early explorer who headed into terra incognita. I'd like to just use Roald Amundsen in Antarctica as our example. He had a goal, a compelling goal, which was worth him and his team risking their lives for. Not just the determination to survive. He was in a race against Scott, and we all know how that worked out. Why was he successful? In part because he had a better plan, and in part because he had a better suited team. But in part, it was also because he had the flexibility to learn on the hoof. I don't know whether you're aware of it, but one of the things that really hampered Scott's expedition was that a lot of his men suffered from snow blindness. And Amundsen only had 2 cases of snow blindness. Why was that? They were both doing the same trip pretty much straight at the same time. Well, the answer was that Scott, being a military man, always had reveille at 7 o'clock in the morning, and they would go through to 3 in the afternoon, and they would always walk between those 2 times. Amundsen realized that if you did that, then you walked straight into the sun throughout that time, because it was the South Pole and summer. So all he did was change his time of reveille, which didn't really make any difference because it was always light, to something like 7 in the evening and through till 3 in the morning, and the sun was always on their backs. That's agility. It's adapting to understanding what's going on around one. Businesses that are unclear on their goals and simply trying to survive will not attract those with the curiosity and talent to survive. Their horizons will be limited by subconscious rules, and their appetite for risk will not be great enough to keep them exploring. So they'll always be beaten to the prizes in any market or surprised by the challenges. Next, empowerment without direction. Teams thrive on structure and clear lines of accountability. So saying to your team, you guys are free to decide without offering guidance is like dropping an egg and saying, fly. That egg contains all the genetic capability to soar with the eagles, but it takes time and effort to nurture the contents. An agile leader achieves results by focusing on and developing their people. Finally, formulaic solutions. Agility contains a number of standard features. Remember the traditional versus agile lists, but it takes a different form in every organization. The big players in the heyday of business process reengineering became very rich by McKinseying or BCGing their clients. What we found, and certainly in introducing agile project management approaches such as Scrum in organizations, that agility is only sustainable if developed by those within it and nurtured by their constant attention. For that reason, it's not susceptible to standard approaches or formulaic solutions. Second block is playing the wrong game. Now, again, let me just put up two games, FIFA and Age of Empires. You may be familiar with them. There are a number of obvious differences between the two, but the critical distinction in relation to agility is that one is finite and the other one is infinite. Let's just have a look at those two. To be agile, organizations have to be clear on what game they're playing. So, finite games. They have a set duration and set rules. They are like FIFA and all sporting contests, although my wife says not like Test cricket, they have a finite duration. Success is based on short-term focus in a limited area, and decisions are primarily tactical based on the situation players face in the game. The aim in a finite game is to win, and decisions are based on your best interests at the time. That's agility in relation to the tactical situation. As far as the infinite game is concerned, they never end. They have no set boundaries. They have no known or they have unknown or changing players. And in that case, their focus is on the way they did make decisions is using values-based decisions. That's the best example of the consequences of playing a finite game with applying a finite game mindset to an infinite game is that of George W. Bush declaring mission accomplished on the deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln at the end of the Second Gulf War. Mission accomplished? Well, I'm not sure. Infinite game success depends on a core set of unchanging values which guide the player to make consistent decisions based on the long term, irrespective of what new situations or players crop up. When empires fail or fail to thrive, and I'm sure you can identify instances of this, is generally because they've lost sight of their values and begin making decisions based solely on short-term interests. Agility is an infinite game, and in the absence of clear, commonly held values, it descends into quick tactical wins and diminishing returns. Okay, looking up for leadership the idea of expecting leadership for above is indicative of a traditional mental model of leadership, which is incompatible with agility. When I say incompatible, it has features that need to be in an agile organization, but if you look at most organizations, most company organization charts, there are variations on this triangle. The CEO at the top, line workers at the bottom. There's a broad base of interaction with the marketplace, and everyone has their own clearly defined roles at each level. Every subsequent level is there to control and coordinate those activities and bring focus to the structure. All of these, by the way, are necessary. Broad interaction, coordination, and focus, really important for organizations to be successful. The agile solution acknowledges this, but it turns the organization on its head. If you look at this, same roles, different relationships, very different relationships. While the traditional hierarchy naturally engenders a command and control mentality, the agile inverted pyramid promotes collaborative values or makes emphasizes collaborative values. The position of the CEO now is to act as the point of balance for the whole organization. But what's obvious is that she or he cannot do this alone. Successful agility depends on the active and intelligent participation of every department, team, and individual. One group I was coaching who presented this model made the point that looking downward for leadership was also wrong. Agility requires people to look within themselves for leadership. Now, at that point, the team leader feared anarchy and needed to be reassured that they were still looking to him for what their direction should be as an organization. His role as point of balance was critical to the whole operation. Agility demands vertical alignment within the organization and with corporate goals and objectives and lateral engagement between colleagues. In that regard, an agile organization is a bit like a murmuration of starlings. I don't know whether you've ever been lucky enough to see one of these, but if you do, and you can see in that picture just a snapshot of what it looks like, but in a live video, it's extraordinary, or in real life, even more extraordinary. And you'll never forget the incredible shapes that a flock makes in flight as each bird reacts to the ones around it. Now, if you happen to be watching that in real life and in a quiet spot, what you'll notice is that these flocks are also incredibly noisy. I don't speak starling, so I don't know exactly what they're saying. But my guess is that it's roughly along the lines of coming right, look out above, give me space, or perhaps oops, I'm sorry as well. Agile organizations need to be equally noisy places as they require a constant stream of real-time, accurate communication. That way, everyone can be given the space to spread their wings and make the adjustments that other people need. Not an easy feat, but wow. Just imagine what it feels like to get it right. Okay, I'm going to hand over now to Anne-Marie, who's going to talk to you about the fourth block, which is the wrong culture.
Thank you, Peter. And I hope everyone can hear me now. So, yes, wrong culture. One of the things that we're very conscious of is that we're trying to sort of talk about kind of establishing organizations in a coherent way. And one of the things that really helps in that regard, sorry, Peter, could you move me on to the next slide, is making sure that every organization has an absolutely coherent narrative or story that binds it all together. We've talked about this earlier in terms of sort of having overarching goals. But one of the things that's interesting about this is it very much goes into the insights about what it takes to be human. A great book by a guy called Noah Yuval Harari that many of you may be aware of, called Sapiens. In Sapiens, Noah talks about the idea that one of the things that the tribe sort of, or the variant of hominid, Homo sapiens, one of the reasons that section survived was actually because it became able, through the development of the brain, to understand the whole idea of myth and story. Other versions of hominids had only got to a point where they could use sort of relationships and gossip to get to a size of about 150 people. To go beyond 150, we have to have some kind of coherent story to hold us together. Now, in cultural terms, that can be something like religion, or of course, in organizational terms, it comes down to what's your vision, what's your mission, objective, strategy, and sets of goals. And that has to be really clearly understood and fully embodied by people for it to be established as part of driving the direction for a particular culture. Next slide, please, Peter. Another thing that gets to be a situation where you've got a wrong culture is if people within the organisation don't trust each other. And we talked earlier about the Gallup and other research that tells us that engaging our employees is absolutely critically important, and we have to trust each other. Now, me just saying, okay, I'm going to go into a room and I'm going to tell you you've got to trust each other is, of course, is not enough. We have to be able to make sure that we really work with teams and with people within organisations so that they feel that they can trust each other, and that often sort of means working with them to get people to understand exactly how emotion works and why we feel strongly about particular things and particular people, and why that we react in the way that we do. Another area that is really important is about making sure that we have a strong set of values within an organisation, and of course that there is a coherence between the values that we say we believe and those that we actually put into action. I mean, it's very clear link back to the old adage, actions speak louder than words. And I'm sure we've all been part of situations where leaders have told us one thing and then actually acted in completely the opposite way. We must absolutely make sure that we do everything that we can to get feedback loops in place so that the values that we say that we believe in, things like trust or ambition or diversity, we then actually follow through with. Unwillingness to address conflict. Yeah, this one gets me every time. I do a lot of work with organisations about helping them to collaborate. And many people think that if you're going to collaborate, then that means that you're being nice to each other. And I want to sort of nip that in the bud right now if there's anybody on this conference that thinks that. Because actually, if you're going to collaborate, you have to be able to be normal. You have to be able to express your opinion. You have to be able to tell it how it is. And that means, humans being humans, that there will be differences of opinion. And you have to be able to have the skills in place to take on board different opinions and to deal with conflict. And that's difficult for a lot of people, actually. That again, that's back to this good old emotion. How do we manage emotion within those situations? Not many people relish the thought or the feeling that's associated with people telling them that they're wrong. So again, how can we work with people to be able to raise conflict and to quote a colleague of mine, to be able to disagree without being disagreeable? Wrong rewards follows on from actions speak louder than words in many ways. There's definitely something about we get the behaviour that we reward, and I'm sure many of you who have families would have seen this many times over. Again, back to again to a lot of work with organisations about collaboration. The best of those will make sure that when contracts have been set up, they will have collective basis of rewards in place as well as the individual basis for rewards. Because if you're not rewarding people collectively and only rewarding people as individuals, absolutely and for sure they will only behave as individuals. Next one is around kind of uneven focus on results. That's really important too. If people feel that there are some individuals in their team who are working harder than they are, or there's unhelpful competition in place about who's winning on results, back to are you winning or are you not losing, that concept, then again there will be an impact and you will end up with a culture that is unhelpful in terms of being agile. And finally, arrogance and complacency, deliberately provocative language in many ways. And again, this comes back to many organizations, they find the secret of being successful, and they find the kind of a way of doing things, and then they stick with that way of doing things, and they become very good at doing it in that way, but it can impede them from looking around and being able to sort of really read the environment that they're in, and from changing, because they know what they're doing, don't they? You know, the things that they've done and the way that they've done them have always served them well. I think right now is very definitely a situation where we all need to be holding the mirror up, having a good look around and seeing what can we do differently in relation to what is required from us today. And at that point, I'm going to hand back to Peter.
Thanks, Henry. So that's one input, and hopefully it's been useful, giving you a few ideas to think about. What I would say, feel free if you have any comments or that you'd like to put into the chat box, or alternatively have questions for the panelists that we can either answer at the end of this or take offline. I'd be very happy to hear from you. What I want to do now is just switch from what blocks agility to a few ideas that often we use as conversation starters around the whole area of agility. If you're thinking in terms of getting people to discuss agility, then often it's posing the questions or maybe provoking a thoughtful consideration of what it actually means in some way. It's part art, part science. And if you look down that list, you may well recognize some of these, or you may well recognize the truth of them. Why they're useful is because often, you find yourself saying, I agree, so how do we do this? Or I don't think it's as simple as that. In which case, to ask them, well, what's the complexity that's missing? Take a moment to work through these and make a note of any that you particularly feel are relevant to your situation. Again, if you feel you'd like to post some thoughts, then it'd be really interesting to know what those are. By the way, the one that says, if everything seems under control, you're just not agile enough, I think it was Mario Andretti, who Formula One driver, who said, if everything seems under control, you're just not driving fast enough. Other than that, anyway, okay. Again, as I said, it's something that if you would like to reflect, like in the chat box, we can see something. The audience can't see what other members have written. It just goes to the panel. If that's the case, it may well be that you've got to send your chat messages to everyone. We've got a number that coming through now, so it seems to be working. But just please remember, when you're selecting who you're sending your chat to, if you want to question the panel, then do so. If you want to get everybody, send everybody something, just make sure it's everybody. Okay, let's we're coming to land, so to speak, and what I'd like to do now is just spend a bit of time looking at 5 practical steps that organizations we work with take in moving towards agility. The first one is to define what it is that is your core purpose and what your core assets are. Some of you may know the book Good to Great by Jim Collins, and he talks about what he calls his hedgehog principle, the overlap of 3 circles in a Venn diagram. What am I passionate about? What am I world-class at? What can I be world-class at? And what fires my economic engine? How can I ensure that my venture is economically viable? You may have done this. If you've done this any time in the last year, that's great. If you haven't, probably it's one of those things that needs revisiting. The stock take isn't just of physical assets, but it's also things like brand, engagement levels, skill base, and your client base. Let's go on. Once we've defined, this is important, by defining our core assets and purpose, we've defined that why I referred to. And now it's a case of designing the how. Design a strategy that leverages your capabilities. Now, there are 2 ways in which very often the design process takes place. And what we found is that lean startup approaches are now being widely used in agile organizations to engage the market early and involve real clients in the design of new products and services. And many of you may already be doing that. Agile organizations treated initiatives as experiments and set up mechanisms to get real-time feedback on how clients have responded. Some of them even decide to shorten the development cycle by testing different versions of an idea on different parts of their client base to see what gets best response. This approach, of course, isn't one that just works in the market. It may actually be one that you trial in the first instance on internal change initiatives. And in both cases, the key is to be in a position to gather, interpret, and share data with the objective of maximizing the speed of learning. Remember that aphorism, which was that agile organizations build to learn. Step 3 is now creating an engaged culture and being really rigorous about monitoring it. I mentioned, culture is the cornerstone of agility, as Anne-Marie said. Getting it right is vital, and it's an uncopyable or really difficult to copy source of competitive advantage. As mentioned earlier, the engagement surveys, such as the Q12, show that there's a clear causal relationship between top and bottom quartile engagement and business unit performance. I'm just going to give you a few statistics. 12% increase in customer loyalty and engagement, 16% increase in profitability, 18% increase in productivity, 25% reduction in staff turnover, 49% less or fewer safety accidents or safety incidents, 37% less absenteeism, and a 60% improvement in quality. There are fewer mistakes and defects. The really interesting thing, it's what I refer to as the discretionary 10%. Engagement and a culture of engagement means that people give what you can't force them to because they are there voluntarily. That's when all their creativity, their willingness to go the extra mile comes in. It takes time, money, and effort, but surely with results like these, it's a worthwhile investment. Step 4 is to empower people. Again, I'll just quote a book, Turn the Ship Around by David Marquet. He describes the agile leadership style he employed to turn his ship from the worst submarine in the US Navy to a model of excellence to which everybody else had to aspire. Core to this was a set of behaviors he described as leader-leader behaviors to differentiate it from the traditional follower model that he was taught as a young officer. His contention, and one that really is at the core of an agile culture, is that rather than creating followers, a leader's role is to empower their colleagues to be leaders in their own areas of responsibility, driving decision-making down to the lowest level of authority and competence, and inverting the traditional top-down briefings with bottom-up, what he called certifications. And finally, invest in technology. Now, agility, the possibilities of agility really have been brought to the fore by this uptake in technology. Because agility requires a continuous flow of useful information about the state of the organization and its environment. To be responsive or agile, organizations need real-time information for decisions and learning. There's also the possibility of with API-first development, which is very much a digital economy coming on board, the enormous potential as a means of integrating supply chains to provide new and valuable sources of new and valuable services for clients, and of course automation. One of the positive outcomes of the pandemic is that it's forced people to adopt new networking technology to the point where they now feel very comfortable with, or now feel comfortable with a virtual network environment. what a transformation from the steps that we had a year ago. Sure, there have been glitches and frustrations, and some people don't like it, but not everyone, and not everything can be done virtually. But I suspect that most of us can identify certain ways in which our lives have been improved by working remotely. Before handing back to Anne-Marie, Churchill is credited with saying, "Never waste a good crisis." And with that in mind, traditional organizations seeking to become agile might choose to reframe this current crisis as an opportunity to push them out of the ruts that have served them so well up to now. Change is here to stay. So we just leave you with a few last thoughts on leadership.
Thank you, Peter. So if we're really going to kind of make sure that we don't waste a good crisis, let's see if we can make our organizations agile. And to do that, we absolutely have to make sure that everybody is aligned and that there is a sufficiently robust culture and sufficiently engaged workforce so that everybody knows what they have to do. And like that flock of starlings that Peter referred to earlier, they just know how to move with the ebb and flow of whatever the world is throwing at us right now. One of the key points in that is that we need to be able to make mistakes. We have to have something embedded within our culture, which is there is no failure, but failure to learn. And that requires us to really understand how we react and why we react in the way that we do and learn to manage ourselves, basically. So on that note, just want to leave you with one final thought. If Peter will send me the next slide, which is, in our opinion, life isn't about waiting for the storm to pass. It's about learning to dance in the rain. Thank you all very much for your attention. And does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask us? In which case, please put them in the questions box. And or the chat box. I think we can cope with both versions. Peter, any final words from you?
No, thank you very much indeed for your participation in this morning's session. If you do have any further questions or comments, follow up, then we'd be delighted to hear from you. And we wish you all the very best with the future, whatever it holds, and hope that this session has given you some ideas with which to approach it.
Thanks, everybody.